We often talk about the left of the political spectrum as one united movement. However, there are many different strains of left-wing thought, and they don't always see the world the same way. Joining us now for more on these groups in North Bay, Ontario via Skype, David Tabachnick, political scientist at Nipissing University. And David, it's good to have you on TVO again tonight. How are you?
I'm doing very well, Steve. Thanks for having me on.
Not at all. Good to have you on. When we talk about the left, as we suggest, it's actually a much more disparate entity than perhaps people give it credit for. But are there certain concepts or values that anyone who considers themselves part of that big left tent would ascribe to?
I would say yes. The two I would immediately identify are an effort toward fundamental equality of all people, and second, the promotion and protection of human rights.
Why would they be different from what a conservative might say? Surely conservatives believe in the equality of all people and believe in human rights.
Well, when we're talking about equality from a leftist standpoint, we may use the term social justice to help define it. And that suggests that this is not just an equality of rights, but a more fundamental equality, equality of gender, equality of race, and even an equality of wealth. On some of those issues, I'm not sure if conservative positions match up so well.
Well, because I'm going back to my philosophy first year 101 now, but conservatives, you suggest, are more interested in equality of opportunity, whereas liberals, people on the left, more interested in equality of outcome. Does that get at it?
I think that's fair, and it very much relates to the idea that people on the left have an interest in helping the disenfranchised, the alienated, the marginalized. These are the people that perhaps from no fault of their own, just by the position of their birth or the place of their birth, they've been put in a position of tremendous inequity. And so people on the left look at the state as playing a role in solving that inequity or addressing that inequity. So we would have things, let's say, like a universal health care or public education, public housing. All of these things are institutions of the left or policies of the left that you see all around the world and certainly in Canada. And the effort, again, is towards this concept of equality and social justice.
I'm going to go back at you one more time on this because I think, for example, if a red Tory were in this studio taking part in this discussion, a red Tory would say, I sign on to all those things as well. Is there less distinction between the left and red Toryism perhaps than at first blush?
Well, I guess that's the red part of the red Toryism, wouldn't you say? I mean, when you're talking about issues, let's say like universal health care, I'd agree that a red Tory would be supportive of that sort of thing. Is there really a place for red Tories in today's Conservative Party? Perhaps not. And we have actually seen a lot of movement and machination around conservatism, and that has certainly mixed things up on what counts as left or who is a leftist.
Okay, let's move on. How does the left understand, in your view, the concept of power?
Well, I think there's a fundamental suspicion of power in many leftist movements, and you can see that as one of the main cleavages or tensions that exist in leftist movements. So I think a big question we have to ask when we look at the left in Canada and around the world is, do we achieve these goals of equality and social justice that we just talked about through within the system or outside of the system? And so we would have some disagreement there. We would have party politics, the NDP, but then you would also have activist movements such as Occupy Wall Street that wanted to work outside of the system. You have insiders that attempt to create policies such as universal health care that I mentioned before and public education. And then you have people working outside of the system that say the entire system is corrupt or imbalanced that leads to this inequality. And in a sense, you can't work within it to achieve the ultimate goals of the left.
We're going to have a discussion about political correctness immediately after you and I are finished this interview, but I wonder if you could tell me how you think political correctness came to, I'm tempted to use a pejorative word here, so maybe I will, came to infect the left.
Well, if you look at the history of the term politically correct, I think we might be able to get part of the answer here. Initially, the term was used by Marxists, even in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and essentially the idea was if you were politically correct, you were on the right side of history. You were for the revolution. Now, much later on, we're talking in the mid-50s, 60s, the term politically correct took on a new meaning. Instead of attempting to overthrow the state and set up some sort of workers' paradise, the idea instead was a cultural revolution or a social revolution where we wanted to change and challenge the meaning of certain words and certain parts of our culture so that they would no longer stand in the way, again, of social justice, of this fundamental equality that we're seeking. And so the left embraces political correctness as an attempt to reveal these hidden obstructions. And so it's not surprising that people find it somewhat offensive or intolerant, because it necessarily is criticizing the majority culture. And so this radical minority has put themselves in this position to challenge the majority, and makes most people uncomfortable. But frankly, if you look at some of the history of the left in association with political correctness, you see tremendous success. Would we say the women's movement was part of this politically correct movement, or the civil rights movement was part of this political correctness, or the gay rights movement? Now, maybe at the time these seem like radical or even absurd positions, but today these are mainstream positions. So in a sense, that's the success of the left, of political correctness. And we might see the same thing happening now with transgendered rights and transsexual rights. Again, to a lot of people, some of these debates seem absurd or the product of some sort of ivory tower university debate. But in actual fact, similar to these other movements, we may see some fundamental change happening through political correctness.
Let's go back inside this big left-wing tent, and as we suggested off the top, there are a plethora of views that exist under this tent of left-wing thought. Perhaps you could outline just some of the sort of classic divisions among left-leaning thinkers?
Well, I think in Canada, you have seen historically some of these divisions, agrarian populism versus, let's call it, factory floor unionism. And sometimes these two different parts of the left were on opposite sides of the issues. So the agrarian populists wanted to embrace free trade so that they could sell their crops. The factory workers didn't like the free trade idea because it could potentially threaten their jobs. So that is a classical division on the left. And we see some of that today in, let's say, the division between the labor left and the environmental left. The labor left might want to see something, let's say, like the Energy's pipeline be built because it could create jobs or protect jobs, whereas clearly environmentalists are very much against this pipeline because it could pollute the environment. So that is a fundamental division that does exist on the left. But again, I would say for the most part, the social left or the cultural left and the labor left have worked very well together. It is the labor movement that worked towards ending sexism in the workplace, recognition of gay rights when it comes to things like health plans and pension plans. So there's not really as big of a division as we might think between the social left and the labor left, but certainly it's a cleavage that has been identified.
And following up on that, one often hears red Tories describe themselves as fiscal conservatives, but liberal on social issues. I wonder if how common it is to go the other way. For example, I'm very liberal on. Someone might say I'm very liberal on economic issues, but I'm quite conservative on social policy. Do you hear much of that?
Not here so much. I don't think that sounds all that familiar to me. But I guess the implication of that question is: can the left take all comers? Can there be a big tent left-wing party? And that tends to be quite difficult. Partly for the reasons I mentioned earlier, where perhaps the most activist or radical people that might be attracted to left-wing politics don't see party politics really as the place to achieve their goals, and they look to outside of the system. So it's very difficult to find sort of those big tent issues in a practical sense, even though probably most of the people in the movement, if you want to call it that, agree with the goals of left-wing politics. They just don't agree on the means.
Well, a couple of minutes left. Let's touch on a couple of more things here. Do you see much overlap currently between the left's political movement in Canada and left-wing political parties here in Canada?
Well, what has seemed to have happened is that the most activist and radical people that may have at one time wanted to participate in left-wing party politics don't really see a place in the NDP now, and they look to other places to express their political views, NGOs, various social movements, civil disobedience, protest movements. We've seen that occur a little bit more. We see that in the United States with this Occupy Wall Street movement. And the question again I would ask is, how successful can those movements be outside of a party system, outside of power institutions that actually can change policy and law? Without that activist ballast or anchor, I can see that the NDP has very much drifted more to the center. And we may say that really the distance between the Liberal Party and the NDP has shrunk considerably over the last few election cycles. We've seen this provincially as well in Ontario. And the question is, how do you pull a party like the NDP back to the left or further left? And you need activist people. You need people in the party expressing their viewpoints. And if they're not welcome in the party or not interested in being in the party, then that drift to the center is going to continue.
Well, in our last 30 seconds, certainly one of the biggest developments in Canadian political history over the last quarter century is the uniting the right under the banner of the Conservative Party of Canada. If you're a lefty in Canada, you've sort of got a choice between the NDP, the Liberals, the Greens. If you're in Quebec, maybe the Bloc Québécois as well. Can you see a big left tent politically in this country?
Well, based upon what I was just saying, I think, in fact, what you're looking at is a unite the center movement. It's not really a unite the left movement. Where is the truly left-wing parties in Canada embracing historically left-wing positions? Is today's NDP that party? More than the other parties, but really they are fighting that battle for the center, and that happens in Canadian politics. If you're seeking out power, if you're seeking government, you need to appeal to the greatest number of people, and the center is that place. And so to unite the Liberals and the NDP, I suppose that's possible. I've heard a lot of people talking in that way. At the very least, there's the idea of a coalition government. To do something like the Conservatives have done, I think you would need, like they had, a third party or a new party, not the NDP, not the Liberals, but something, let's say, like a Liberal Democratic Party. And that seems to me a possibility in the future. It all depends really what happens in the next election cycle or the next couple election cycles. Will they be willing to work together? It doesn't seem like there's any movement within those parties now. There's lots of talk around the parties about that unite the left, or as I'm going to call it, the unite the center movement.
Gotcha. David, thanks for joining us from North Bay tonight.
Thank you.
David Tabachnick, Nipissing University.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.